Hey, how you doing? Um, this does not happen often, but apparently there was some sort of snafu this morning when I was in class, and the web option crew were not able to capture the lecture. So they've asked me if I would retape the lecture from this morning so that we could use that for the web option people. As you know, this doesn't normally happen, and so obviously I honestly should say at this point I think this is the only time this has happened in years of me using the web option, so they actually have an amazingly high rate of excellent service. So every now and then things go wrong, something went wrong, so be it. Now the only bummer about this is I did something in class this morning that I really can't reproduce well in this environment. In fact, I can't reproduce it at all in this environment. So I'm going to have to tell you what I did. So let me start with the story. Literally, while I was on this slide, I intentionally just talked to the class about a few things going back and forth that didn't really mean anything, all of which was really set up for me to walk towards the podium. And then as I got towards the podium, I pretended that I tripped and fell flat on my face so that my head was kind of behind the podium and my feet sticking out, and then I didn't move. As I described to the class, I took a lot of drama in university. One of the things I did on the side, which I think is very helpful, by the way, but I was never any good. But I have to say this morning, I was pretty darn good. So it seemed as though I convinced the class pretty well that I had fallen down and something serious had happened, and I hadn't moved. I wasn't moving. So what then happened is the following. I could hear a few gasps as I fell down, a whole lot of whispering, a whole lot of talking, but I laid there, and for at least, I would say, 15 to 30 to 35 to maybe even up to a minute, nobody seemed to move. I don't know how long it was. Let's say 30 seconds, because actually they did do something pretty quickly, relatively quickly. But let's say there was a good 30 seconds when nobody did anything. When somebody did do something, it was somebody from the sort of middle part of the class who did not come down to help me, but she came down and hit the red emergency box at the door, which kind of surprised me because I'm not used to those emergency boxes being there, and that wasn't really, I didn't want to create a false alarm kind of situation, so I felt a little bad about that. But it also attested to the fact that the class seemed convinced that something went wrong. And the important point of all that was, in a class with maybe 150 people present, when I clearly needed help, it took a long time for anybody to do anything, and even when they did do something, they did not come directly to me to help me. They went to the box to get somebody else to help me. All right. I was doing that to make a point. And I was doing that, in fact, to replicate a relatively famous situation that occurred and was exaggerated, but really kicked off a whole psychological investigation that actually ties together a lot of the things we've been talking about. So let's go there. I should have had this maximized, sorry. But let's go there. And so now you have my story of what I did in the class. Let me tell you another story. We're going to start with a couple of stories. And this one's the story of Kitty Genovese. Kitty was a murder victim, but it was a very dramatic kind of murder. So to set the stage a little bit, she was murdered in 1964 in New York City. Before that time, especially like in the decades before, I think 1950s in America, a lot of Americans lived in rural kind of situations. So they lived in farms, small towns, small villages. But sometime around the 50s, the phenomenon of urban living really started to take off. So a lot of people left the countryside and moved to the cities. And in fact, some people were quite concerned about that. They were worried that humans might lose their humanity somehow if they end up being grouped together in such large numbers. That worry was fueled by the Kitty Genovese case. Here's what Well, let me give you two versions of the Kitty Genovese case, because it's the first version, which in fact was false in many ways, but this first version really kind of got people thinking and worrying and kicked off this whole psychological investigation. So according to an article in the New York Times that occurred just after the murder, they described it as follows: that Kitty was getting off work at about 3 a.m., was on her way back to her apartment when she was attacked from behind by an assailant. That assailant, Mosley here, you see a sort of picture of him in the corner, stabbed her twice. And at that point, she screamed out and said things like, "He's got a knife and I'm being attacked," and she was screaming and screaming and screaming. And she was in an area of an apartment complex. And according to this original story, many people had windows open and many people were home. In fact, they claimed there were at least 38 people who could hear the attack happening. Now, one of these people at the point, shortly after Kitty was stabbed, one of these people cried out and said something out the window, "Leave that girl alone," or something like that. And that was enough to convince Mosley to back off, but he didn't go away. He backed off, went back to his car, put on a hat with a brim to kind of hide his face a little bit more, and then he went back to find Kitty. And when he did find her, he attacked her again, slashing her many times with a knife, and again she was screaming for help during this whole period of time. He eventually subdued her, raped her, stole some money, and essentially left her to die. This whole attack occurred over a space of about 35 minutes. And so, if you believe this original reporting of the story, 38 people witnessed an attack that occurred over 35 minutes and did nothing to intervene. Now, it turns out that story was massively exaggerated. The correct estimate of witnesses is more like 14. Most of those had their windows closed. Some of them said they heard something, but it could have been a lover's quarrel or a spat. They didn't really realize somebody was being attacked. Only one person heard any reference to a knife, etc. So, it was exaggerated. But that being said, it also really caused a lot of discussion, a lot of stir, and a lot of people to say, "See, this is what happens if you live in cities. You lose your humanity, in a sense." So, a couple of psychologists thought that was kind of interesting, and they ultimately devised an experimental paradigm to try to look at a phenomenon like this. So I'm going to show you a little bit, and I'll narrate as it plays, so you have a sense. So here we go. So what they did is they have this situation where participants come in, and in this condition the participant is alone. So she's just being asked to fill out something on a survey, and she's left alone. But while she's filling that out, as you see, smoke is pouring out from underneath a door to the right. And the question is, what does she do? And what you see is very quickly she goes to investigate a little bit, and when she doesn't like what she sees, it doesn't take her long to go and seek somebody to kind of help with the situation. So off she goes. So that went pretty quick. Now, here's another subject straight ahead of us, a different subject. But now we've done the following to this subject. We've put her in a room with, I believe, about 5 other Confederates. Now, these Confederates are going to completely ignore the smoke and the situation that's going on. They're going to just continue doing their questionnaires if there's nothing. Now, you see, she's noticed it, and so a timer starts. And she's just trying to figure out what to do. Notice what she's not doing. She's not doing what the previous participant did. That is, she's not going over to investigate. She's not talking to people around her about it. She's not going to get help from an authority figure. She's just sitting there. And we'll have a little bit of time lapse go by here. 5 minutes later, she's still sitting there. She's obviously aware. She knows what's going on, and she's obviously concerned. Obviously feeling like maybe she or somebody should be doing something. And yet there she sits for 6 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes. And in fact, she doesn't do anything until she's called out of the room. Okay, so, and there's many more like this you can see on YouTube. Let me just pause this so it doesn't play everything. Yeah, okay, go ahead. Right, I'm just going to pause. Phil Zimbardo talking about probably bystander interference. Okay, yeah, sorry, Phil. Shush, Phil. All right, let's get back to this. When you do studies like that, and let me show you some data that refers to it. If you have a situation where somebody is in need of help, or something should be done about a situation, what you typically see is the following. If there's only one person there, that person has a very high likelihood of intervening in some way. And so this is 0 others available to help. If there's nobody else available to help, you tend to help. If there's one person there, you already drop from about an 85% chance of helping to about 60%. And for each additional person that's there that could help or could do something, the likelihood of you doing something drops and keeps dropping. That is what I was trying to show in my class. A class of 150 people. I created a situation where I needed help, and by and large, the vast majority of people stayed glued into their seats. In fact, everybody stayed glued into their seats for about 30 seconds. But eventually, one person got up and did something. In fact, somebody at the back of the class said something really interesting to me after class. She said, I watched, I knew somebody should do something, and I kept looking at the people in the front row. Why weren't they, you were right in front of them, why weren't they getting up and helping you? Why were they sitting there? It seemed weird for me to have to do it because I was in the back row. But I was starting to think maybe I should get up and see if he's okay. But while I was thinking that, then I saw the people in the middle of the room go and hit that little box for help. What is going on here? Well, when psychologists talk about situations like this, they say if someone helps, those people that help have to go through a few steps. So first of all, they have to notice and interpret the situation. So they have to realize, hey, there's somebody there that needs help. And this is where the classroom demo is a little weird, but it makes the point in a good way. Let's say somebody thought I was just doing what I was doing. That he's just joking, he's just fooling around, he's just trying to make a point. Well, if that's your analysis of the situation, then obviously you might not go to help. You might say, well, let's see what he does with this now. But I was pretty convincing. I think I was pretty good. So I think most of the class saw this happen, and I think most of it interpreted it as I was in need of help. But now this is the next step that's so critical, and I think ties a lot of what we've been learning together. They then have to say it's up to me to help. And this is the part that seems so tricky. So it's brought up this whole concept we talk about in psychology called diffusion of responsibility. And the idea here is the more people that are around us, the less I feel like it's up to me to do something. The responsibility to do something is spread or diffused among all those people there. And so whereas if I'm alone, I feel a whole lot of responsibility, and I can guarantee you if I were teaching to one student and fell down, that student would come help. Okay, they would feel a lot of responsibility. But when there's a lot of other students, that responsibility gets diffused and it's less on me to do something. Okay, let's take this concept and talk about a couple of other things we've talked about so that you understand how generally valuable it is. Let's talk about the Milgram experiment. The situation where you have an authority figure standing behind you saying, you say, I don't want to give this person any more shocks. I don't want to increase it. And they say, no, you have to. That's the experiment. Please continue. Please continue. In that situation, it's even more extreme than diffusion of responsibility. It's more moving the responsibility totally to the authority figure. It's a situation where you can say, hey, he told me to do this, and therefore if I do it and something that goes wrong, If this person is really getting hurt, it's his fault, not mine. Okay, you're transplanting now the responsibility to somebody else, which is freeing you up to do things you would never normally do. Certainly you wouldn't do them if it was perceived that it was you that was the cause of the action. So responsibility is important, and if we can put it off on somebody else, suddenly we'll do things we wouldn't normally do. Stanford prison experiment, we can talk about that too. The guards all started acting like jerks, but they acted like jerks as a group. And therefore no one of them felt that the behavior of the guards is my fault. We are all in on this together. We are all sharing the blame, and we're all reacting to it the same way. And so again, this responsibility for some of the actions they were doing was diffused among the members of the guards, and that kind of allowed them once again to do things they wouldn't normally do. The difference with the bystander effect is the diffusion of responsibility is allowing you to not do something you would normally do. And that thing is to come to the aid of somebody in need. Normally our instinct is to do that, but in the bystander example, we diffuse that and we don't. Now, even in cases where we do assume responsibility, the notion is there is at least one other step we have to think about other than just acting on it. And that third step here is considering the cost of intervention and concluding they're not too high. There are situations like, let's say it wasn't just a prof laying on the floor. Let's say it's somebody who has a gun fixed on me and is threatening. Well, now if you're going to try to intervene and do something to help me in that situation, you're going to put yourself at great risk. And so in that case, you might feel like I want to do something and I'm ready to do something, but I can't do something because if I do something, I'm going to put myself at such great risk that it's not going to be helpful anyway, maybe. So there is this whole notion in some of these situations that somebody might not act because of a risk assessment. That wasn't the case in class today, obviously, because there was no real risk in helping me. But hey, yeah. And then once, of course, they decide they have to implement the course of action. Again, the really important concept from all this is that concept of diffusion of responsibility. All right, that's the bystander effect. But again, we're talking in general here about groups and how groups interact, and that's how that relates to that issue. Groups actually being a negative as far as somebody helping somebody else. All right. Moving on. I'm going to move on to a whole different thing. Now, when I moved on to this whole different thing with the class, I started with a question. And the question was, when you're in a class and they're describing an assignment and they say the dreaded words, in this assignment, we will form groups and you guys will be asked to do something as a group. Group work. What do you think of group work? Do you like group work? Do you hate group work? More people tend to hate it than like it. If you hate it, why do you hate it? What's your problem with group work? Keep that in mind. Let's go to here. What this next slide is about is some of the weird dynamics that occur when somebody is put in a situation where there's other individuals sort of doing the same thing. And when you're in the presence of others, does your performance actually get better than it would be if others weren't there, or worse? And the answer is, it depends. Let's do the better first. So there's been a lot of evidence that suggests that if the task you have is more of an individual kind of task, but if you're performing that individual task with other groups who are performing the same task, then competition and other sorts of social factors can actually get you to up your game. So here's an example. Let's say you're a distance runner, a marathon runner, let's say. Or, even let's say 10K. You run 10Ks. You will spend, a lot of time training for an upcoming race. And when you train, you certainly time yourself. You get a sense of where you're at, how well you're doing, how well you're improving with each training episode, etc. But it's very common for runners that when it comes to the actual race day itself, they run faster, they have a better time than they ever do in practice. That is, when they are racing in the presence of others who are also racing, they race faster than when they're doing it alone. Okay, the presence of those other racers and the whole context somehow makes them better. This is called social facilitation, when doing something in a group allows you to do your thing better. And it certainly does occur, but again, it tends to occur in situations like the one I described, where the whole group is doing something together, but they don't really rely on each other so much. It's more the presence of others, not the direct interaction with others. When instead you are put into a group, and that group is given some task to do together, what is commonly observed in that situation is something called social loafing. And this is probably why you hate group work. Let me give you the classic example. The classic example was done with tug of war kind of studies. And what they've done, what do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. So if you took these 8 people and you first just gave them a rope and asked them to pull as hard as they can, and you had a device on the other end that could measure how much force they could pull with. We do that for all 8. So we know how much force they can pull as 8 individuals. If we now put them all together, they should exert a force that equals the sum of their individual capabilities. But what you typically see is that they don't. If you put them all together like you see now and say pull all together, the amount of force they pull is much less than the sum of their individual capabilities. What's happening? What's happening is one of the people, and I would, if I had to pick, I would pick on this guy or I would pick on this guy, isn't really pulling as hard as they might. Well, you might say this person too. She doesn't even look like she's trying. So she really doesn't look like she's pulling as hard as she might. But the classic social loafing thing would be you're grabbing the rope, you're making all the noises, you're grunting, you're doing the posture kind of like this guy is right here, but really you're not pulling that hard. You're not really exerting that much strength. You just want to fool others into thinking you're exerting a whole lot. That's so you don't get detected as a loafer. See, she might get detected. You'd look at her and go, oh, come on, put something into it. But these guys, you'd say, oh, no, they're putting everything they got into it. But are they? You don't really know. They're counting on their efforts being hidden by the total group effort. It's a little bit of diffusion of responsibility, in a sense, going on here. So this is obviously also the worry of a group project, that if you get some duds in your group, they might not pull their weight, literally. They might not do what they are expected to do. They might be very explicit about it. Pick on her again. So maybe they just don't do anything. Or maybe they're a little bit more sneaky about it. Maybe they talk a good game, but they don't produce much. So the example I gave in class is, they might say something like, oh, I was up all night from midnight till 5 a.m. trying to do some research related to our topic, and I found some stuff, but everything I found was disputed by something else. And so after all those 5 hours of work, all I could really get is this sentence that kind of accurately captured what I went through. That's these people, right? They're giving this story about how hard they worked, they're talking a good game, but they're not really producing much of any value. And that's what's frustrating, because quite often the students who are more motivated and who care a little bit about the mark end up just stepping in and making the project good, which is probably exactly what the social loafers are hoping for, right? Because then they get a good mark without doing much work. All right. Social loafing's annoying. It's annoying in group projects. It's also annoying in real life, because very often in life, be it in a work kind of situation, or just in a general, around the house situation, often the only way we accomplish things is by working in groups. And if certain members of the groups are not doing their share, well, that's unfair. Let's come back to that. But that just feels wrong to us. That feels unfair. So what can you do about it? What could an instructor do about it? Let me back up there for a second. This is annoying to educators, social loafing is, because most of us feel like you need to learn to work in groups. You need to learn to share ideas and to hone ideas in a group, to express when you like somebody else's idea and want to build off of it, or when you don't. So those skills, those interpersonal skills of working together as a group, are very important And they're one of the things that employers look for and want in successful employees. So we at university want to give you that kind of experience. We want to give you exercise working in a group. But the social loafers make you hate the group work. And if you don't like the learning exercise, you're not going to learn much from it. So we would like to do what we can to reduce social loafing, as would employers. And here's some of the things that a person can do. So first of all, make individual contributions identifiable. So the first thing is, have some way of recording who contributed what. And that alone tends to reveal the social loafers. Like even these guys, it's not about the talk, it's about what did they actually add. And so if you look at what they actually added, and if they know that's going to be looked at, and if they know that's potentially going to be part of their grade, then they're less likely to social loaf. Okay, so one good thing an educator can do is explicitly get a sense of who contributed what to some group project. In addition, one of the things you can do is emphasize valuable individual contributions. So if a certain individual really does something good, there's been data that shows that if you emphasize that, if you highlight that, look at this great thing this person does, that makes it much harder for somebody to socially loaf. It tends to pick up their game. They feel that sense of competition. They feel the sense of attention that person got for doing something well, and that makes them more likely to do something well. So if you ever have to do group work, you can keep these two things in mind. Let's record who contributes what, and let's make sure we highlight, celebrate when somebody adds something really good to the project. The third thing's not really in your control, but it's an interesting thing to think about, which is keep the group size at an appropriate level. As groups get too big, social loafing gets quite easy. So quite often a social loafer can hide. And just imagine the tug of war again. Imagine there's 3 people there and someone's not pulling their weight versus 30 people. Okay, if you have 30 people in this string, then it's pretty easy for someone to disguise the fact that they're not really doing much. And so often, to make these individual contributions identifiable and to emphasize things, it helps to not have too large of a group. The group has to be big enough to accomplish the task, but you don't want it much bigger than that. Okay, little things you can bring in when you do group work. And there might be a little bit of group work relevant to Mind Jig when we get there, but you'll see. You'll see that when we get there. All right, that's great. Now, I brought up an issue with respect to social loafing. One of the reasons it's so annoying to us is it doesn't seem fair if everybody in the group gets, say, an A, but some people worked harder on that than others do. We have this implicit notion of equality and what we call social justice. So this is going to bring us to the next thing I want to talk about, social equality. And this guy here is a guy named Franz de Waal, or de Waal if you're going to be German about it. He is a study of animal cognition, especially primate cognition, but he really has a way of presenting things that make us think hard about ourselves. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the talk, but I'm just going to go to very specific parts, but I'm certainly going to push you to watch the whole talk if you have the time. It's well worth it. But because I'm not going to jump right in the introduction, let me fire it up. 3:30 and 13:50. Let me remember that. Okay, it's a TED Talk. Because I'm not going to do the whole talk, let me give you an introduction that he sometimes gives with this, where he says things like the following. We think of things like cooperation and social equality as very human constructs. In fact, a lot of people kind of associate with the French Revolution, that when we hit the French Revolution, we had this concept that we should have some equity in society, that it's not good to have haves and have-nots. It's better if there's at least some sense of equity. Now, we often think of this as an intellectual thing we've come to, a sort of socio-political way of being that we link to things like communism and socialism, etc., political systems. and we think, this was humans thinking hard about life, and they've come to this. What Frans de Waal is going to show is that it's probably much more primitive than that. So let's just look at a couple of parts, and then I will sort of narrate a little as we go. But I do this is called Moral Behavior in Animals, and I recommend you check it out. There's all kinds of good stuff in there. I'm going to come in here. That wasn't where I thought I was. Here. Okay. And so what Frans de Waal was talking about prior to this is that at a time when religion started to play less of a role in determining what was ethical or what was right, society, and especially more secular society, started thinking about how they could have laws and rules that tried to support moral behavior. And often when they think about morality, they've kind of linked it to these two, what he calls pillars. Reciprocity or fairness, that this is the social equality, that we should treat each other fairly and in a similar way. Think of the golden rule: do not do to others what you would not have done to yourself. And also empathy and compassion, and we should have some of that. So he's going to focus on reciprocity and fairness. So let's watch a little bit of this first experiment, and I'll shut up and let Frans take over.
These are the two factors that always come out. One is reciprocity, and associated with it is a sense of justice and a sense of fairness. And the other one is empathy and compassion. And human morality is more than this, but if you would remove these two pillars, there would be not much remaining, I think. And so they're absolutely essential. So let me give you a few examples here. This is a very old video from the Turkish Primate Center where they trained chimpanzees to cooperate. So this is already about 100 years ago that we were doing experiments on cooperation. And what you have here is two young chimpanzees who have a box, and the box is too heavy for one chimp to pull in. And of course there's food on the box, otherwise they wouldn't be pulling so hard. And so they're bringing in the box. And you can see that they're synchronized. You can see that they work together. They pull at the same moment. It's already a big advance over many other animals who wouldn't be able to do that. And now you're going to get a more interesting picture, because now one of the two chimps has been fed. So one of the two is not really interested in the task anymore.
You almost get the sense of social loafing when you watch this, and you certainly get the sense that the one chimp has to convince the other one to do the work.
Now look at what happens at the very end of this. Takes basically everything. So there are two interesting parts about this. One is that the chimp on the right has a full understanding he needs the partner, so full understanding of the need for cooperation. The second one is that the partner is willing to work even though he's not interested in the food. Why would that be? Well, that probably has to do with reciprocity. There's actually a lot of evidence in primates and other animals that they return favors, and so he will get a return favor at some point in the future.
Okay, so that's one. Again, I can't hit all of these things, but that's one of the nice points from this video, is that there seems to be this notion of what's called reciprocity. So you need help right now? Well, if I help you right now, then I get something in the bank. In the future, if I need help, I will come to you. So that's what's sometimes called reciprocity. And again, we often formalize that in very structured ways in society, but what Frans de Waal is suggesting is that this is a very basic concept that's, literally in our DNA, and that it's in primates' DNA. It doesn't have to be anybody as sophisticated as a human being. Okay, now let's go to the next example, which is very cool. Again, a bunch of other cool things here too. I'm skipping through a whole whack of this stuff. But I want to get to the Capuchin monkeys, which are right here. All right, so I'll go back a little bit and have Frans talk a little bit more. I'm sure he's just about to go on. Let's listen.
There's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food. Then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. Tests a rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Okay, so that's the basic idea. Again, you get the idea why, Frans de Waal, moral behaviors in animals, why I think you might want to watch the whole thing, because it's actually very cool. But what is that showing? And I especially find it interesting at the times when we're dealing with a TA strike here at UTSC, or at U of T in general. What that's showing is this concept that we usually think of uniquely human, but of the concept of social equality. The fact that different members of society should be treated as much as possible in an equal manner. And so this capuchin monkey here is really upset that their cage mate here is getting grapes for doing the same thing they're just getting cucumbers for. He's getting upset to the point where she won't even eat the cucumber. She's throwing the cucumber back. She's so annoyed with the unfair treatment. So again, something as complex as that, and something we usually consider such a human intellectual construct as social equality, seems in fact to be much more primitive, much more part of who we are, of wanting to be treated equally. And that's one of the big challenges of living in groups. In fact, when Marx threw out the idea of communism and described communism, the notion of communism was the ultimate equal society, where whether you're a doctor or the person that milks the cows, it doesn't matter. You're contributing to society and you should be rewarded equally. That's the concept of communism. It never seems to work very well, often because nobody's motivated to do the more difficult or less glamorous task. Who's going to be the garbage man? If you get paid just as much to be the garbage man as the person who plants flowers, everybody wants to be the person that plants flowers, right? Who's going to clean the sewers out? Nobody wants to do that if they're going to get paid the same amount to do that as somebody who's got a much more desirable job. And so, the sort of antithesis of that is extreme capitalism, where you are rewarded based on the value that you provide, and that value is measured by whether other people want what you provide. And so if you create something good and a lot of people want it, then you're going to make a lot of money. And if somebody else is not doing anything of value, they're not going to get anything from that. So it's the opposite of social equality. Most countries, of course, try to find a happy medium. And Canada is one example of that. Many examples are where you have a more of a socialist approach, where you still want to reward people for innovation and enthusiasm and work and all that kind of stuff, and yet you also want to have some degree of social equality. So it's not the case that everybody gets treated the same. We have rich, we have poor, we have all of that kind of thing. but we are still striving to have some social equality in us. So, you know, that part of our psychology seems to be pretty primitive, but it takes the face of all sorts of things like union strikes, where they say, hey, everybody else has gotten a raise over the last 8 years, we haven't, that's not fair. You know, and so we get into those sorts of issues. All right, cool. That was the lecture today, more or less. Usually I try very hard to make sure that you guys see exactly what happened in class, but today that just wasn't possible. But this is largely the same thing people saw in class today. So I am going to leave it there, and I will hopefully see some of you guys next class, or you'll see me online. All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye.